this is actually, I'm Mary Crane, I'm director of the Institute for the Liberal Arts. This is the first time that faculty actually called me up and demanded that the ILA organize something immediately. I organized this panel in collaboration with the Center for Teaching Excellence. The panelists' short presentations are going to be video recorded, and the video will be available on the ILA website and the Center for Teaching Excellence website. The question period will not be recorded so that people don't have to feel constrained in what they ask. I'm just going to briefly introduce all four speakers, and then they'll go ahead and give their presentations. So the first speaker will be Brian K. Smith, who will provide an overview of what ChatGPT is, how it works, its strengths and limitations. And Brian is the Honorable David S. Nelson Chair and Associate Dean for Research in the Carolyn A. and Peter S. Lynch School of Education and Human Development. His research focuses on the design of computer-based learning environments, human-computer interaction, design sciences, informal learning, creativity and innovation, and computational thinking. The second speaker, Paula Matthew, will discuss reading and writing in an age of artificial intelligence. She's an associate professor in the English department and director of the first-year writing program at BC. Her research combines writing activism with mindfulness and contemplative practice to bring about social justice. She's been involved with the street newspaper movement for a number of years and published Tactics of Hope, the public turn in English composition in 2005. Next, Nirmal Trivedi will talk about how to treat ChatGPT in your syllabi, and he'll address wider implications of ChatGPT for teaching and learning. Nirmal received his PhD from the English department at Boston College, and after, directing first-year seminar programs at Georgia Tech and Kennesaw State, he returned to BC as Assistant Director for Teaching, Learning, and Technology at the Center for Teaching Excellence. And his scholarship, and he's going to talk about, so his scholarship combines American studies with scholarship on teaching and learning. And finally, John Fitzgibbon will talk about ChatGPT as an opportunity for the liberal arts. And John is the Associate Director for Digital Learning Innovation in the Center for Digital Innovation and Learning at BC. And he teaches in both the Woods College of Advancing Studies and in the Political Science Department at BC. His research focuses on Euroscepticism, populism, social movements, and the use of simulations in political science education. And he received his DPhil in European politics from the University of Sussex. So they're going to speak in that order, and they can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm an academic, so I'm going to bring up a timer. Make sure that I don't get too academic, if you see what I'm saying. So hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Let me just plug myself in. And great. So great. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having us all here today. Has anyone guys heard of ChatGPT by chance? Cool. As Mary said, I'm going to give kind of an intro to what this thing is and how it works. And partially, as we were kind of planning for this panel, one of the things we said is, that there's a lot of interest in this, a lot of talk about it. It is not magic. There are certain ways that it does work, and that's really tied to some of its strengths and weaknesses, so I'll kind of give an overview of some of basically how this thing works and then why we should care about it here, and then my colleagues on the panel will certainly take it over and give you more information about that. I want to start, though, by recognizing a man by the name of Roger C. Schenck. Roger Schenck was the head of the Yale Artificial Intelligence Group. He then left, joined Northwestern in the late 1989, started something called the Institute for the Learning Sciences, where he started a field called the Learning Sciences. I have a PhD in that field. Roger was also an AI pioneer. He also did incredible work in natural language processing. He just passed this past Sunday. And really, I studied with Roger, and this was the first time when I was an undergraduate. I was a computer scientist, and I got to know his work, and then ended up studying with him as a PhD. We were trying to crack big language problems. And one of those problems in particular, I remember he had students working on something called the Story Archive. This is back mid-1990s, right? In the Story Archive, the idea was that you would have these conversations with experts. And so we had large amounts of video, like maybe there were 200, 300. Seemed pretty big back then. Just storing that. We had video jukeboxes back then. And then at the same time, I remember something called QuickTime was starting to emerge from Apple, right? So this was very early multimedia work. And the idea was that you would say something like, I would like to know something about maybe, the history of war. Like, what does it take to come up with strategies to defend something, right? And maybe it wasn't even about war, but what did, like a good business strategy or political strategy. And you might get a video from Bob McNamara, who was the defense secretary under Kennedy, saying something that was roughly about, that might be related to war, but it was about that strategic question. And then you would say, hey, okay, that was great, Bob McNamara. Now I'm wondering about maybe some other issue slightly related. And by analogy, it would bring up another video clip that would try to explain that. And the whole idea essentially was that you would have this machine that you could have a conversation with, and the conversation would be plausible. We were doing human video generated or human videos because the text generation simply wasn't, you just couldn't rely on it back then. Now, we actually all thought that the reason Roger was doing this because he's a very curmudgeonly guy, and he generally thought he was smarter than most people. So we all thought as grad students was like, Roger really wants to talk to a machine because it would be smarter than us, so he thinks. But anyway, learned a tremendous amount from, and certainly ChatGPT owes a lot to the group, to the studies that he and his group did. So what is this thing called ChatGPT? I'm sure, how many of you have tried it, have used it? So I won't, maybe we'll show it a little bit later in terms of a demonstration of it, but in general, I think many of you know the general idea here is you give it some text and then it spits out some text that's remarkably human-like. The GPT, how many have you all know the chat part, how many of you know the GPT part? Okay, there's a couple GPTs, right? So let me give you basically a very, very basic kind of idea of how this works. And again, partly, because I think it's important that as we talk about this, that we don't have a sense that this is a magical kind of system. So the generative part, right? It's actually, the GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. The generative idea is that this machine, this piece of software, essentially, if you give it a piece of text, some kind of prompt, it's going to generate new content. So I can say to ChatGPT, write me an essay, an applications essay to Boston College as a haiku, and ChatGPT will spit that out, right? So in comes some kind of prompt, it generates new content. There are several other systems that do things like this. Some of you may have heard of DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, Music LM. There's a whole class of these AI systems that have come out in the last year or 2 years that I can say to DALL-E, for instance, I'd like you to generate a picture of German shepherds dancing as they celebrate the NBA Finals, and it generates an image of German shepherds dancing as if with LeBron, at the NBA Finals. Like, so hopefully LeBron, if he gets there, we'll see. They ain't looking good for LeBron this year. Go Celtics. And that's the generative. So the idea is you give it stuff, it generates some new stuff. The pre-trained piece of this is that what's been done is when you go to ChatGPT, it's been trained on a lot of language, a lot of language. It does not change, right? So at some point, even if you ask ChatGPT, how much stuff do you know? It's basically going to say, like, I was trained up to September 2021. I don't know anything beyond that. So if you ask it today, tell me about the great decisions that Ron DeSantis is making. These aren't great decisions, by the way. In fact, they're bigger education problems than ChatGPT, to be quite honest. But if you asked it that, it wouldn't know, right? So it's a pre-trained model. It's canned at some point, and it works. But it's a phenomenal amount of text. That's the pre-trained. The transformer part, it's not this kind of transformer. I had some of these blow over the winter break, so I'm very familiar with these. It's not this kind of, nor is it a robot that changes into a vehicle, which would equally be impressive, by the way, but very powerful. The transformer that we're talking about looks roughly like this. This is kind of the schematic of the underbelly of this thing, right? The transformer model is a particular kind of architecture that in computer science we talk about as neural network, and this is what powers this. If I tried to explain this now, it would take probably we just wouldn't get very far. It's a pretty complicated piece of machinery. So I don't want us to think about it that way, like to dig under the hood. But I do want you to understand something about essentially how this thing works in terms of processing language. And so the term that you also will hear when people talk about ChatGPT is they'll talk about large language models. And the idea here is that this particular application has some sense of language, enough sense about language that it can look at your prompts and then generate new knowledge. So to do that, you have to have a model, essentially, of what human language looks like. So there's been existing models. I'm going to start with some simple models to get us kind of, and then you try to get to the scale. I'm sure that many of you have heard the expression, if you put an infinite number of monkeys in a room with typewriters, they will eventually generate something that looks like Shakespearean text. That is a bad language model, particularly because it's just completely random. Now, there's actually some mathematical proofs and axioms and things like that where people have actually tried to say, well, how long would it take for those monkeys to actually generate something that would be meaningful? But the thing here is, in fact, there is very little of a model, right? The notion of language here is completely random, and it's a bunch of monkeys typing away, right? So here, it's sort of no model at all to some extent. How many of you remember the Magic 8-Ball? I was trying to get one here, but, Amazon. Anyway, normally they can do anything like at an infinite pace. But if you don't remember the Magic 8-Ball, it kind of goes like this. Actually, we can sort of do something like this. Like I might say, Magic 8-Ball, do you think that Billy Sue will be able to give me a promotion and a raise in the near future? As he shakes his head no, it would say, don't count on it. Thanks for being on my side there, Billy. But right? So what's the language model behind the Magic 8-Ball? Those of you who played with it, remember that it sort of took an input, or at least people believed it. They would shake it and they would ask it these questions as if the thing could listen to them. But there were 20 different answers that you would get out of it. In fact, your input constrained, right? The instruction said, ask it a yes or no question. Don't ask it questions like, how do I get to Peru, or anything like that. You can't ask it that. You can ask it a yes or no question. And there were 20 answers that were randomly distributed. This is its model of language. So the only language that this knows, right, is these 20 prompts, and they're randomly distributed. So again, not a very sophisticated model, certainly not ChatGPT, but we're kind of getting there. We're getting there. And in particular, what I want you to understand is it doesn't know anything about my inputs, and it really doesn't have a sense of how to pick the outputs except that it's random. I'm sure everyone knows Morse code. Well, not knows Morse code, but you know what I mean. You know of Morse code. Morse code is an incredible language model in the sense it's not a word now, but we're going to do characters. And the brilliance of Morse code, in some sense, was understanding that some letters are used more often, that they appear more in the English language than others, right? And by encoding that in the code itself, right, you can see that the letter E and T are the shortest symbols. They each have one bit of representation. Z and Q appear less, and so they have different kinds of longer representations, right? And so kind of inverse. The more you use the particular letter, the less bits you want to encode it, right? So now you have a notion of in language, right? If we start to do this, if you can, in fact, give the Morse code this kind of representation to the monkeys on the typewriters and say, actually, with probability, don't just start hitting any keys. Hit E and T more than you would hit the other keys. You start to get something that looks closer to language than if you just did random, right? And so there's a notion, again, of the model that's built into this thing. Has anyone heard of ELIZA? So in the 1960s, this was an AI program. ELIZA was one of the first chat programs. And what it did was, this guy, Joseph Weizenbaum, basically said, I'm going to try to mimic the behavior of a psychotherapist. So he looked at psychotherapists and their patients and the kind of dialogue they had. And here you can see a sample dialogue from that, right? The machine says, did you come to me because you are not, and it doesn't really end. It doesn't have a not what. And the person says, I don't know. And the machine says, what does that suggest to you? And the person says that I'm unintelligent. And Eliza, the machine, says, how long have you been unintelligent? The person says, since I was born. And the machine says, I see. So very kind of psychotherapy, right? I mean, you could kind of see how the dialogue was, in some sense, trying to mimic, right? He says, it starts to talk nonsense, and the machine says, I'm not sure I understand you. Can you elucidate your thoughts? So there's sort of this understanding, right, where the thing can generate language, right? But people are now talking unconstrained, and behind the scenes are these rules, right? A rule that says something like, if the person says any combinations of words and then happens to say the word you, and then there's any number of words, and that's terminated by me, for instance, you hate me, right? You transform that pattern that you see. You do a pattern matching, and you transform that, what makes you think I blah you, right? So if it was you love me, the machine would say back, what makes you think I love you? If you then said you hate me, it would say, what makes you think I hate you, right? So just simple pattern matching. So the language model, again, is I'll take any kind of text you have, and I have these set of rules that structure the language in a way that I'm always going to give you an answer back that looks reasonably good until you start pushing on it, right? All of these models will eventually break at some point. Oh, no, that's a good one. I was like, let me skip ahead. But actually, this one, I'm sure you're very familiar with, right? We all use this on our phone. You start typing in your chat or some of these applications, and you say, I need a car too, and the machine is now giving you, what are good words to follow that? I need a car to get to the store. I need a car to go to the store. I need a car to drive to the store, right? So those are the kinds of things that it's predicting. And again, it knows a lot. How does it know? We've essentially trained the machines to look at probability. So if you think about that, it's really saying the machine has this sense of, there's a math at the bottom for those of you who are into that kind of thing. I mean, it's really sort of conditional probability. It says, what is the probability that the next word should be drive, given that I know a sequence of, basically, this person has typed, I need a car. I need a car too, right? And so now it can make some sophisticated guesses. And you could essentially build a table that says, if I see these three words, what are the next ones likely in the English language to follow? Now, if you do that, if we did that for like a paragraph, we could do that manually. It would take a while. To do that at the scale of something like ChatGPT, right, is an enormous amount of computational effort. And so its language model roughly does something like that. Let's assume that that's the right way. And another thing to understand is really a lot of our a model like this might look at what are the 3 or 4 words. If I have 3 words, need a car, what might be the next? And I'll look in small windows because that's what we've been able to do up to this point. With massive computational power, you can now say, you'll hear people talk about ChatGPT and say it's got attention. And what it really is doing is it's paying attention to every word that comes in a way that no machine model has done before. And not only does it have this very sophisticated attention, it's being trained on enormous amounts of data. So Common Crawl is essentially a data set that's available on the internet. It is, in fact, the internet that's been archived. So it's 410 billion tokens, or essentially words, that are available for this thing to look at and go, what are the probabilities, if I see these things, that the next word is going to be? And if you do that for 410 billion, 19 billion from web text too, in fact, Common Crawl is essentially just the internet. The designers of ChatGPT, of the GPT language model, realized we got to give it something else. So Books 1, Books 2 is actually printed books that have structured format, nonfiction, fiction books, so that it can actually learn how to, because I don't know if you know this, but some content on the internet isn't necessarily all that great. So I hear. Or maybe that's fake news. I don't know. But anyway, so they realized if we train it on the internet, we better train it on, right? Wikipedia, again, 3 billion tokens, because Wikipedia at least is structured in a way and has been fact-checked enough that they can feed it to that, right? So enormous amounts of content, petabytes of content going into this model and essentially building that probabilistic table that I was talking about. That's essentially what this thing is, right? So you put some words in, and somehow the magic is just very sophisticated mathematics to spit out something, right? And it is an incredible achievement in terms of the technical side. So again, as a computer scientist, I look at this and go, we've been trying to do this in AI for a long time. And we didn't have the compute power, we didn't have the data, we didn't have a lot of things that make it possible now. So it really is a stunning achievement. Having said that, we're going to talk a lot about, there are some downfalls, right? It is not perfect. And so it's important for us, certainly as educators, to now think about, if I put on my education, my learning sciences hat, I go, aha, we got to think about this in a different way. So why do we care? Right, and this is a quote, this was early January. I'm sure many of you, I'm sure you all heard that the New York City School District said, we're going to shut this thing down. In fact, some of the early ones were around almost January 3rd, they were saying, look, this is causing a real problem for our students. I don't think there was actually any students in school at that point, by the way. I don't know if anyone else noticed that, but in fact, some of the fear of this was like students are cheating, and it was like, well, they're not in school. They're actually on Christmas, like, there's a real interesting social side of this thing too that's been happening where people are going like, it's going to destroy the world. You know, it actually hasn't. I mean, no one's, in fact, it's been down for the last 4 days. But anyway, there's a bit real fear, and it certainly makes sense. And I think that with the New York schools, right, they're not the only ones. I mean, I received something from my school district just, well, I guess it was Monday, that said, here is our new policy on ChatGPT, right? So it's happening, it's there, and we certainly have to think about that in terms of education. I think another interesting response to this, right, there's the fear, but I find that there's another response that where people, I guess they go the other way. There's not the this is an evil thing, but in fact, there's the, it's so good that it's going to do something else. And so if this particular quote is from a friend of mine, David Kleeman. He runs, he's actually runs sort of metaverse efforts for a company called Roblox that does a lot of, is a huge kids software company. And he's responding to somebody who said, hey, I'm sending my kid to a private school where there's no technology, because I want the kid away from technology so that they can, really learn, sort of in this pure kind of way. Now, I don't know what that meant, because last time I checked, the printing press was a pretty good technology too, and writing implements were pretty good. So I presume he means pooters, the pooters. So let's get them away from that, because those are apparently bad. But my friend David responded to this guy who said, I'm going to take my kids to private school where there's no technology. My guy says, well, you know what, that's easy for you to do, because I bet you have that stuff at home. But for a lot of people, they don't have the opportunities to do that. In fact, they are looking for technologies to support their kids, and they are going and trying to get Wi-Fi from McDonald's and other places for their kids to be able to have the opportunities, right? So I thought this was a fantastic response. I was like, that's pretty good. Like, it's really thinking about justice, and like, this is about equity, and it's not, you can't just pull the tech. Anyway, the response, and this was also in the conjunction of a ChatGPT discussion, the response was from this guy, and he said, look, that's one way to look at it. We'll all soon, the problem we'll all have soon is that digital economy is here. Education, as we know it, is going to be completely revolutionized. So that's the point I want to say, that no, not by a software program. I mean, I haven't seen it happen that some particular piece of technology would change everything, the way that we do education. So I think there's a lot of sort of overblown things on both sides, and we're going to try to give the middle ground, the kind of, everybody stop, take a deep breath, and let's kind of think about this. And so my last point is also, I mean, some of you may have heard this, I was asked this recently, and I just want you to know that there may not even be a reason to talk to these three, because like whatever the due time is, I mean, if we're all going to die because of ChatGPT, I mean, I'm sorry, class dismissed. It doesn't even matter. But this was actually coming from House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, right? There was a hearing about this, and the quote that was said to the committee was, with superhuman AI, there was a particular risk that is of a different sort of class, which is that it could kill everyone, said a doc student. I mean, he may be a smart doc student, but I also want us to realize that there's probably little probability, again, of your toaster ovens. Like if you go home tonight, I mean, let me put it this way. If you go home and your Alexas are talking to your Roombas, I would get out of that house. But I don't think it's going to happen. And so what we're going to try to do is not take on these extreme views, but I invite my colleagues now to talk more about ChatGPT. And now you know a little bit how it works. And now let's think about, what is this thing? Why do we really care about it in the context of our teaching and learning? So. for you, I think it's this one, right?
Thank you, Brian. Hi, thank you, Brian. I am not a technological expert, so we're going to go on the other side of the spectrum. I teach writing, and I run the first-year writing program, and so like many of you here, thinking, is our job obsolete? Is there a need for what we do? So that's what I'm going to talk about. Thinking about what does it mean for reading and writing and for our pedagogy in this world. And like I said, I'm not an expert. My research has been mostly conducted by my high school daughter and I spending a lot of time on ChatGPT together, thinking what it does well, what it doesn't do well, and having some fun. And so I encourage you all to think about that too. So I wanted to start, and I think this is a complex question. So in what ways is ChatGPT a new problem? What are the new kind of challenges that we're facing that we've never had before? And in what way is this a form of a problem we've seen 100 times in thinking about paper writing mills and Turnitin and Wikipedia and other kind of things? So I think the answer, at least from what I know so far, is right now it's a little of both. That we already have in place a lot of tools to help think about how we use or implement or address ChatGPT in our teaching. And so one of them, see if the hyperlinks work. As a writing studies person, I'm a member of the Council of Writing Program Administrators. Oh, and it's not mirroring the screen. Do you know how I can get it to, I clicked on the link. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, that's. This is not my computer, so
No.
I suddenly.
Yeah, it's like,
In case I didn't need to demonstrate that I wasn't the technological one, I thought I should.
right, so do you know how to do the?
Yeah,
By the way, I just want to point
it's right
out
over here.
that ChatGPT is an amazing piece of technology. But you know what? The hardest problem in computer science is getting the PowerPoint thing to work on it. Never fails. Never fails. Whoever solves that, billionaire.
All right, so I was saying I'm a member of a organization called the Writing Program Administrators, and they have a statement on defining and avoiding plagiarism, and it really outlines best pedagogical practices. You can Google this. And it talks about that the definition of plagiarism occurs only when a writer deliberately uses someone else's language, and but it fails to draw a distinction between purposeful kind of plagiarizing and careless not knowing how to cite ideas. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But if we think about our fear is that the students are going to purposely use ChatGPT to write papers, right? That's the question I want to think about now. And so this document, some of the questions are the same. What causes students to plagiarize? One, when they aren't really taken through a process, they're given an assignment and then it's due. So, breaking it into a lot of subparts might be helpful. But also talking about assignments that aren't generic or easily repurposed. So when you ask ChatGPT to talk about the main themes in a work that you can find online, it's going to do a pretty good job of that. So that might not be the kind of question you want to ask your students. Or you bring its answer into class, and that's another thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I think this document is a good metaphor for thinking about this is a shared responsibility. Like, what are we doing as teachers to really teach our students how to write, different genres of writing, and focus on the student as a learning writer more than just the texts they produce? Because if all we're grading, if all we're assessing are the texts they produce, it'll be easier and easier for them to reproduce something like that. But the more we are grading them going through a series of steps, investigations might be useful. All right, back to my That is not mine. Okay. Can we, okay. It's okay. That was it. I'm not going to take you all over the internet today. So that's a good, for those of you who are worried, that's a good document that talks about when do students plagiarize. It's most often when they don't understand the assignment. There's a lot of research done on when and why students plagiarize. And thinking about what is the relationship we have with our students. Are we going to have a relationship that's about policing them and being worried about the text they produce, or creating a process where we really work with them as writers and human beings every step of the way? And then if they plagiarized, use ChatGPT to get started, they would still have to take that on a journey. Another concept that I think is important for you all that comes from the field of writing studies is this idea of patch writing. It's a concept developed by Rebecca Moore Howard. And I often see new teaching fellows panicked in first year writing, and they say, my student is plagiarizing. And it's in a rough draft. It's not a graded draft. And it's that the student copies from a source, deletes some things, makes a few minor changes, and doesn't cite it adequately, right? And so if we police that as plagiarism, we're missing that a lot of the research that Rebecca Moore Howard does shows that that's a developmental step in learning how to do that on their own. And so if we treat patch writing as, okay, what you're doing here is patch writing, that's a step towards using the sources in a correct way. But if this were a final draft, you could get into trouble. You need to cite where your sources are. So one question to think about is, what happens if we use ChatGPT as a source of patch writing? And we have them cite the text that they use. It's just another source like any of the other. That's a possibility. Because the more you look at it, it can rarely probably give a hand-in ready paper, but it might do some other things. So I think the question you all need to think about is, what do you want to teach your students that involves writing? I think that's ultimately the question, and it's a deep and it's a complex question. And why should what we're teaching our students matter to them? Because if we have buy-in from them that what they're doing is a tool for living, and that's what we say for the first year writing program, we try to teach writing as a tool for living. That if it really is a tool for helping students manage their lives, manage things interpersonally, understand, ask questions of the world, then it might be a little less likely that they're going to want to turn to an AI all the time or exclusively. So I asked ChatGPT a lot of questions to see what it did well and what it doesn't do well. And for those of you, whatever kinds of writing you do, and many of you already probably have done this, but I think the more you do it, the more you get accustomed to what it does well and what it doesn't. So I've seen the danger of a single story taught in a lot of classes, literature and first year writing in high school all over. So I just said, write a college essay connecting this to contemporary life. So I want to call attention to, right at the beginning, it understands the genre conventions of an academic. I didn't say this was a TED Talk. I didn't name the author, but ChatGPT knew to write in her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, punctuated correctly. Novelist, so we get a sense of who she is as a writer. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie explains, So those are important skills for a student to know the first time they introduce a source, to do it that way. It's not particularly fun to teach, it's kind of basic boilerplate stuff, but so that's something they could take away, like, oh, you don't use the writer's first name, you make sure you make a sense of where they are, you situate that writer a little bit. So if you look at this, there's other things it doesn't do so well. It does connect it. It says connects it to Black Lives Matter, so it actually answers the basic question in a fairly surface way, but it kind of does the job. So, I wanted to see how specific I could get, so I asked it to write 500 words about being a new student at Boston College and working out at the rec center. And it had a lot to say, and it says, can be both exciting and challenging. Well, that's a fascinating, but it's adjusting to the academic rigor of college coursework, but then it does talk specifically about the rec center and its state-of-the-art equipment, and so it draws things from the web. But this is a two-part question because it's being a new student at Boston College and working out at the rec center, right? And it kind of, the first half, it talks only about being Boston College, and then it kind of adds on this stuff in the rec center. So it's clumsy, but it's kind of useful boilerplate information. So I could see if you had an assignment of getting students to investigate a place on campus, to ask ChatGPT what it knows, look at this together and say, what does it do well? What does it miss? And why should we go observe a place? Why should we interview someone? Why should we take the time to do the things we do? And so I think rather than only banning or fearing ChatGPT, thinking about what happens when we include it in the conversation, what happens when we get our students becoming critical readers and writers of ChatGPT. Oh man, this is so generic. Most of the information in here is pretty generic. Okay, then why are details? What do details do in a piece of writing that make it more useful? Why is this feel generic to you? What does that look like on the page? So I think you can start with these kind of texts. This was, I think, the best it did. Write a horror story starring the Duolingo owl. I don't know if any of you are Duolingo fans. Trying to force someone to do their Spanish lesson because, if any of you do Duolingo owl, you kind of have this experience. But this could be in a course where you think about what is the genre of horror? What does that mean? And do have the students give you a prompt that you could do in class, that you'd get a lot of buy-in, and then suddenly you could see, what does this do well? What is it not? It will keep haunting her for the rest of her life. Like it ends, like an urban folktale. So thinking about especially genre conventions, I think that's a really fruitful place where, like, what makes a horror story a horror story? What makes, my daughter was having it write fan fiction with certain characters, and what makes fan fiction fan fiction? What makes a poem a poem? Its poetry so far is pretty bad, I will say that. If I had it write a poem about my dog, it didn't do a very good job. But like, what makes a poem, and how does the poems you're teaching in a lit core class differ from the poetry that ChatGPT creates, and why does that matter? So those are just some of the kind of questions. This is interesting. Primary research is not something ChatGPT can do. So I said, can you, because I thought it could maybe, because I'm sure Quasi's been interviewed and there's information online, I thought it could maybe piece together an interview. I wasn't sure. And it says, I am a machine learning model and do not have the ability to interact with people. Well, there's a real clue for us as teachers of writing. Let's get our students interacting with people. The more we do that in our assignments, then we don't have to worry about that. I thought it would do this really well, write a story without using the letter A. And as you can see, it couldn't even get through the first sentence without doing it. I thought that was something a machine learning model would do very well. So I was surprised. So I encourage playing around with the students. And I know Noelle here and other people have already, many of our graduate students are already doing this in their classes. And so I asked ChatGPT, what should I tell teachers who worry that students will use ChatGPT to write all their papers? And so you do have a valid concern. And of course, it recommends more software, which I am not a fan of. I think plagiarism detection software is not worth the time or the investment. But you can always ask it the question. So these are just some final thoughts. I think this really causes us to recenter the experience of writing over the product, right? So maybe you have your students have activities where they go somewhere on campus and interview someone, or they observe natural phenomenon, and then they compare their own experience to a text. You know, other kind of things that the machine learning model can't readily do. And thinking less about filling up a thesis and making some kind of depersonalized. Academic writing is often characterized by its lack of the human. And maybe we need to put the person back in, put the human back in the humanities, and that it's about mixing one's feelings and reactions to what they're reading or writing about. It's another option. And really seeing that writing can help students do things. It can help them organize their own chaotic minds. It can help them plan. It can help them apologize to a roommate. It can help them understand questions. And so when we really think and take seriously the idea that writing is a tool for living, then students will be less inclined to want to ship it off to have a machine do it, but that they want to learn how to use these tools themselves. And then primary research is very useful because, you know, going to the archive, go to the Burns Library, go spend 30 minutes in the Recplex and observe what's going on and write about it. That's something that, at least now, I mean, the machines might get better and, like Brian said, kill us all, but for the moment, it can't go hang out somewhere on campus and observe. And then finally, just the idea of metacognition, which is learning about learning. You could have a lot of writing assignments where what you're grading isn't the thing they wrote, but almost like an artist statement about the metacognitive reflection on, here's the process I went through, here's what my first draft looked like, here's how I changed it. So, and if someone were to write another draft with ChatGPT, they'd have to become a whole fiction writer to write this other thing. So, so really leaning into that metacognitive writing might be a way to help do that. And more, and I just, as I close, I want to just mention, there's already in the current 2022 Best American Essays, an essay that was created as a question and answer session with a chat AI, and it's called Ghosts by Vohini Vara, and she was trying to write about the death of her sister and couldn't, so she kept kind of giving it more information. And so it really is a process, and that's a piece you could use in a course to really look at why and how did this writer use this as a tool for trying to get at the question she was doing. And if that's where ChatGPT ends up as yet another tool like Wikipedia, like word processing, like a web search engine, you know, then we'll be okay. So I'll let other people continue, but thank you.
Those two, yeah.
Oh, there it is, yeah. That should be it, yeah, great.
All right, cool.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I am going to be a little bit more conversational. I want to not spend too much time talking. I want to have a conversation with you all. I want to hear concerns and thoughts from all of you, because I think that, you know, have a lot of value in that exchange. I will say I'll come at this from a slightly different angle and actually take a little bit of a devil's advocate kind of point of view and say, yeah, the earth, you know, the sky is falling and, you know, it's chaos. What are we going to do? Because I think some of those concerns are legitimate, right? And so I think we should air those and think about those more clearly. At the Center for Teaching Excellence, we have a resource here that it's not just the dinosaur, but actual text, you know. So some strategies, some very practical ways of thinking about it, and the way that, you know, we've written it up is to think through both immediate, you know, kind of ways to change things if you want to do things this semester, very short-term kind of thinking, and then longer-term planning and course design and thinking through how you might integrate ChatGPT in your work. So I'll talk a little bit quickly here about, you know, some some practical ways to think about it in your teaching, and then, you know, address some of the the bigger implications for teaching and learning, and then discuss some things that I've seen in syllabi that is emergent and interesting and that we might think about. I think one thing that I think hopefully everybody's seeing too is there seems to be a thread, right, about valuing process over product, right? There's one way to think about how to meet this moment. There's another thread that's saying banning something like this outright is probably going to be a little counterproductive, because if students aren't using it, or we should expect basically students use it whether we ban it or not, right? And so it's just a question of, are we developing a kind of adversarial relationship to our students in that way, or do we want to address something and be transparent about what tools they are actually using to help their own teaching or their own learning experience, right? So we're seeing some of these threads. A couple practical things that can be done is, and you've seen this already, is by looking at what you already are asking your students to do and run it through ChatGPT and see what happens. I think I did this with a faculty member yesterday, and it was really interesting. And I asked her, I said, hey, so this is a quiz question. I ran it through ChatGPT with her, and I said, what would you give this answer? And she was like, well, yeah, that's a C. I mean, it seems well written. It seems it's grammatically correct, but there was something missing there. And I think that something missing is what is truly important to pay attention to. And I'll touch on this in a bit, is in terms of the bigger thinking about teaching and learning and our profession, is that what this moment is really highlighting for us is that there is success in college and the experience of students. There's a certain level in which we accommodate and we want to reward passing, meaning passing as in passing as an authority, passing as an expert, passing as someone who knows what they're doing, who lives by the phrase of fake it till you make it, right? And say that is something that people can do. And then there's that second layer underneath of you can pass, but can you think critically? And we always have a hard time defining what that is. But can we think about the logic, the context, the external schema in our minds that makes things more tangible, more personal, maybe more human? There's a really interesting exercise you can do in the ChatGPT where you can ask it a question like, you give it a scenario. An old man talks to his father. And who is the older man in this context? So all of you would say, yeah, the father, right? Okay. ChatGPT responds, the old man. Right? So what's really interesting about that is that one level it's passing, you're like, yes, in this context, the old man is the older man. And we could say, yeah, that's right. Wait, is that right? The thing is, the technology doesn't have the external schema of a family and isn't able to reference what that means in the sort of lived experience of people. So we have to end up designing our assignments and work to think about what that external schema is that we're actually looking for, in addition to maybe that first level of passing. So running your exercises through ChatGPT will give you a sense of what kind of question are you asking here? What level at which are you asking this question? And I understand that you want to be able to assess students at different levels. So that's something to think about. It's always really important to know, and this is alluded before, it does not access the internet, in case everybody thought. It does not access the internet. It is limited in a closed system up until data that it's culled up till September 2021. So ask it, what happened yesterday, and doesn't know, and it can't process that kind of information. So if you're designing an assignment, if it's ask it to reference things that are after that time. Use references that are very current. Ask it to do personal anecdotes, ask your students to incorporate that kind of work. The theme here, I think, is also that its limits are both in terms of its logic and its data set, right? So those are two things that we want to be able to really firmly understand, and also show your students that you understand that too, right? That all faculty understand. They're like, here's some of the issues that we see with ChatGPT, and so it helps actually to communicate in a lot of ways what you're valuing in class. Is that thinking, right? Is that logical thinking, right? And just making that example of an old man talks to his father and it just can't do it. The other thing it often does is makes, in the spirit of passing as a scholar or as someone who's really learned how to be an academic, it also makes up references, right? It'll say, in a 2011 article based on this and that, and you look it up and you're like, that doesn't exist. And then a faculty member, corresponded with me saying, I said this, and then I asked ChatGPT, why wouldn't you just say that instead of just being like, and why were you trying to be so deceptive? I was like, have a conversation. And it said, I'm really sorry about that. So it was like, it's like an office hours conversation I had. So it's, that is something to show your student, to show the students, show that like these are the limitations that we have, and it's an important thing to understand, not to scare them, but to illustrate the difference between what is passing and what is thinking, right? The really practical, serious concern that might require a great deal of labor for all faculty are multiple choice questions. Understandably, if you can imagine, ChatGPT does really well with multiple choice questions. It is designed to provide the most likely answer, right? It's like as Brian was saying, it's probabilistic. So in the way that we design our multiple choice questions, if we're using test banks that are provided already, we should think through whether those questions are going to be easily produced and responded to very quickly. Some practical ways to work on that is, setting very strict time constraints on a multiple choice exam, using something like a lockdown browser so students, are within the frame of the multiple choice, the screen and stuff. So, there are some practical ways, but it just illuminates the bigger question of what are we actually assessing when we're asking students to complete these multiple choice questions. And are we really getting to the learning that we want to? But I understand that there are very practical reasons why we do multiple choice. In terms of bigger implications, teaching and learning, I mentioned them a little bit at the beginning. There are two that I want to highlight. One is, when the calculators came out, like, there was a lot of concern there. A response to that was, show your work, right? Show how you got there, right? You had that a lot after the calculator came out. And now we're finding that showing the work is actually really essential here to think, even in the humanities, in the writing professions, like portfolio work, show the thinking, show the development. It's becoming more and more important, right, for all of us. And equity issues. Eventually, ChatGPT is going to be, and all these AI tools you're going to have to pay for them, right? This is an open research thing. It's free to use now. Everybody's going to have to pay for them, and it might be quite a bit of money. So what we will likely find, and something we need to be attentive to, is the potential inequities that that's going to cause. Those who can afford it are going to be able to use it. Those who can't afford it won't be able to use it. And this is something that I've heard a lot and I've read about, and it's very true, that nobody really cares about teaching until poor people try to cheat. And that's when we are concerned about it, right? When the privileged, when the wealthy, cheating all the time, taxes, whatever it is, it's okay. We'll say that's too bad. when poor people try to do it. That's the problem, right? So we got to be attentive to this question about equity as we design our work and what we value and what we assess. Last thing I want to mention is basic syllabus. Things that are like on our website, on this resource site, you'll find some examples of different kinds of ways to put this, a policy about ChatGPT use and AI use in your syllabi. One is you could ban it outright, knowing that's probably going to be a losing battle. The other one, next one is say, you can use it, but maybe a certain percentage of it. Cite the source, okay? Basing that a lot on honesty of that, because to be real, who's going to actually check every single piece of work that your students produce and run it through something? Hard to know, but what you're signaling there is that you want to acknowledge their use and sort of work with them. And the third kind of way to think about it too is to say, look, we're gonna, and I think John will speak to this a little bit, we're gonna use it. We're gonna be open, we're gonna be transparent about it, we're gonna see what it produces and we're gonna critique it, we're gonna use it to start some things and then see what its limits are, etc., right? So different ways to think about how to incorporate it into your syllabi. There's Ethan Malik at, where is he? Wharton, thank you. He has a really smart syllabus policy that is linked to in our resources site. So that's something that we have, and it's going to be completely constantly updated. Last thing I wanted to mention is some of the just a concern that I want to alert everybody to is in accusing a student of plagiarism, you sort of want to have incontrovertible evidence, right? Like I have you completely, this is exactly word for word from Wikipedia. That's not really possible as here, because you can't just Google what ChatGPT will produce and say that's it. So being sensitive and careful about that issue is something that we should all be aware of in terms of how we interact with our students. Lastly, I think if there is programming, there's ways that we at CTE and also the Center for Digital Innovation and Learning can support you. We have this 2-question survey that we would love for you to fill out really quick, just to indicate to us what kinds of things would you be amenable to in terms of additional programming this year and going forward. Okay, thank you.
All right, I think it's here somewhere, Brian, is it?
Yeah, it should be on the web browser.
You use Safari? Yeah, there it is.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, great.
Right, everyone. My name is John Fitzgibbon. I work at the Center for Digital Innovation and Learning. We've been here for a long time, and I want to hear your comments, so I'm going to go far too quickly. So, Noel, if I go way too quickly, just throw something at me or something like that. So should we be concerned about ChatGPT? I thought about quoting somebody on campus that's very famous and down with the kids, and it's not Amy Poehler, it's this guy. So who is this guy? This is some guy called Socrates, and this is a bit of a long quote, but I thought you could pretty much replace the word books with ChatGPT, and this is what everyone is saying right now. I got that from the internet, so maybe that's not as quoted in Plato and Phaedrus, but I've read it someplace else. So it will introduce forgetfulness into the soul of those who can't learn it. They will practice using their memory. You've discovered not a potion for remembering, but for reminding. You provide your students with the appearance of wisdom, not with its reality. Isn't that what a lot of us are thinking right now? This tool will blind these students, will dumb them down, this kind of thing. And I think that was written down in 300 BC. So beating your quotes, Paula and Brian, by a couple of hundred years. So the big idea that I want to get across, like I said, I'll try and be nice and quick. It's pretty simple and everyone's covered it before, is pluses and minuses. So with regard to this new technology, we're reading all this catastrophizing stuff that people have said before, But also there's some positives there as well that I think we should take a bit, that I think normally, and Paula, in particular, you mentioned some really great points. So I'm going to reference these ancient technologies that have destroyed our brains for many years. 2 books, the first one of which is The Second Machine Age by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. So a really good book, I think, for 2014, something like that. 2 economists, I know, Chan, I know. But they talk a lot about advanced technologies, and in particular about all these people are going to lose their jobs. But at the end, I think their conclusion, their analogy is really, really powerful. And use the analogy of a guy called Gary Kasparov that none of my students had heard of last night, which is terrifying. And I'm sure, as many of you here remember, he fought these chess battles against Big Blue, and he lost. But what they say is that what nobody talks about is that there was a second round of chess matches where Gary Kasparov had a very simple IBM ThinkPad, and he destroyed Big Blue. The idea behind that being that computers are not going to defeat us, because humans and computers and technology together is what will let us prosper. So this idea that exactly what everyone is saying here, you ban it, you get rid of it, is just not going to work, because all these technologies, like books that were pushed from, like pencils, things like that, like chairs, all that kind of stuff, we have brought into our teaching practice, we have brought into the academy, and are central to it. So pushing back against it is simply not going to happen, for the reasons I'm going to talk about in a moment as well. So that's big idea number 1. So big idea number 2 comes from another book from a few years ago. Kathy O'Neill, I think she might have come and talked here before. I can't remember. I think it's from 2016. And so she was a quant at a hedge fund, and she basically realized that algorithms are destroying the world as we kind of know it, because there are inherent biases within them. So she left working on Wall Street, making a lot of money, to just, I think, perform in a ska band or something like that, and do lots of nice things. But her big argument is that technology is us. So if we're looking at ChatGPT and are blinded by its brilliance and that kind of thing, actually when you dig underneath it a little bit, I think as normally you're pointing out quite nicely, that it's just a language learning model built by humans. So it's built by humans, and that's meant to be our inherent biases. When I put into to the ICANN project, that's what I got. It is humans and our inherent biases as well. So it's not getting these perfect answers that I think Paula did a really good job of outlining why it wasn't quite great and something like that. Why is that? Because humans are imperfect. Humans have biases. So if we take it as perfect, that this is the answer right here, we have the gospel right in our hands, we're acknowledging that humans are infallible. And of course, we know that's not true. So we have to go into it with our eyes open and understanding the things it's not very good at. So I think, Brian, you mentioned DALL-E. So when I put into DALL-E, a college professor using ChatGPT in Boston at night in January on campus in the style of Chagall, I get something like that. So maybe that looks like something. So again, pretty much reiterating what you were saying, Normal. Number 1 thing is explore it yourself. So log into it. Don't use your BC credentials, as Dave Escalante would tell us. Use your short form, or use your own email for it. But use it with your own work. Test it out. Try it with your course content. And most importantly, I think, discuss it with your disciplinary colleagues. So that's where you get a great opportunity to think, what are we doing in our discipline? So I've been going to the political science blogs and sending stuff in there and talking to our colleagues there, and they're giving us some really good ideas for different use cases for it, because we tend to catastrophize by ourselves. But if you're doing that, then your colleagues in other places in your own department are thinking exactly the same thing as well. And I think, Nirmal, thank you so much for putting that QR code up there. You have great people like Nirmal and the rest of the CTE crew there, and ourselves in SEAL to help you and negotiate these complex problems. Again, to reiterate Nirmal a little bit, so transparency, share your findings. So ChatGPT gives you a great answer for it. So this is what I did in my populism class on a Monday. I put in a midterm question I gave last year. I put up the answer it gave, and I asked the students what would they give it, A, B, C, D, or E, or fail. And 90% of them said give it an A, and a couple of people said a B. And I asked, what did I give it? And I said, I gave it a fail because it's not referenced. And they're like, what? Blew their minds. But then in that moment, I realized, A, it wasn't a great question. It was pretty easy Googled. But also, I wasn't, as you were saying, Nirmal, I wasn't being super, and Paul as well, I wasn't being communicative with my standards. And I need to have a very detailed conversation about what I was looking for. And again, exactly as you were saying, Paula, boilerplate, good, totally okay, but missing something. And we had a 40-minute conversation, and at 6:05, 20 minutes after they left, about what it means to be original. What does original thought mean? What it means by use examples. All the things I want them to use. So in being transparent and being open about it, you get to have a great conversation with students as well. But of course, that doesn't work for everyone. But if you are going to not allow students to use it, if you are going to revert to blue books and things like that, be open with students about why. So I was talking to some professors in another department, and they said we have to go back to blue books because students have cheated, unfortunately, in the past, and we're doing a disservice if we don't do that, because when you move forward into the junior and senior classes, if you do not know this, you're going to fail, and you're going to fail badly. So being open and transparent about the why, not saying you're 100%, you're going to fail, you're going to cheat, you're terrible, but having a good conversation with students to communicate them. I think, Nirmal, you said that very eloquently. So very finally, trying to finish nice and early, a very final thought. For me, the key skills I think Paula mentioned, and you mentioned, Nirmal, and Brian as well, is discernment. And according to people like Akua and Billy, that's a big key outcome of, of a Jesuit pedagogy, and in particular, a liberal arts education. I think that's a kind of good way to summarize everything that's been said here today. And we should be open that this is a great opportunity for us. Because we're, not to say we're getting ahead of the game, but it's happening in real time. And we can have those conversations about what does it mean, exactly as you were saying, Paula, what does it mean to be human, to recenter the human in that? And there, we know that this is literally not human because a computer generated it. So what is missing from that? So we get to have those wonderful conversations about what the value of theology is, of philosophy, of literature, things like that, that in a way maybe get disseminated by a little bit by our social media generation. I was talking to some people in careers recently, and they said absolutely working with AI will be a key skill, because in any workplace, you need to be able to work with the latest technology, if it's AI or whatever it is. So we're doing our students a disservice if we're not bringing these technologies in and at least acknowledge them. We don't have to use them entirely, but at least acknowledge their presence in our worlds, because when we send students out into the world, they will be expected to use these technologies, and we can give them our skill set as practitioners and give it to them so they can use that in their own workplace. I think it's a very powerful tool, discernment, in an age of disinformation. So the great concern, there's a great Ezra Klein podcast, has a great conversation about this, if you follow him at all, about the possibility for chat tools to be used for disinformation. Get a whole bunch of people, put a whole bunch of material out there, send it all out, put it over social media, and you have disinformation everywhere. So we talk to our students about it, we bring it into our coursework, we guide students in what to differentiate it from it. We're giving them an extremely valuable skill set. So the question, I think, normally raised it, and Paula, you gave some excellent examples. What we have to think about is how do we center it in our own teaching practice. For me, I'm changing all my midterm questions because they're terrible. But also gave me the opportunity to do what I wanted to do for a long time, and that's bringing data visualization into my work of political science. I've been very lazy about it and not doing it, and I took that big step of like bringing that in and making a big effort from it. So it's a little bit different than if you're John with 300 students that can all do a data viz project. More, 400, 500, 600. So you can't do that. So it's different for everyone. So that's a lot of thinking. That's a lot of work. We have great colleagues like Nirmal and the rest of CTE and ourselves to help you along with that. So hopefully that was a good summation, hopefully, of everything we're saying. I think it's a big opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity for Boston College of Liberal Arts Education to understand it at a deeper level. Thank you.